What if I told you that your body, right now, might be carrying memories from 4,000 years ago? Not in your mind, not in your family tree, but deep inside your blood, your bones, your very cells. What if, without knowing it, you were walking through the ruins of an ancient world every single day? Because that's exactly what scientists discovered when they studied the DNA of modern Greeks. Nearly 80% of their genes match the people who lived in the Aegean long before the Trojan War, before Homer sang of heroes, even before the first marble stones were laid for the Parthenon. Long before we had names for gods, cities, or history, their blood was already flowing. Think about that. Thousands of years of conquests, famines, diseases, migrations, and yet somehow, the Greek genome barely flinched. While most ancient European populations were wiped out, blended, or buried under layers of newcomers, the Greek people stayed. Their DNA survived what nearly every other culture could not. And that should be impossible, because history didn't go easy on them. Alexander's armies marched out, Roman legions came in, Slavic tribes crossed mountains, Ottoman rulers took the throne. Yet the genome held on, as if something was protecting it, as if a voice from the past refused to go silent. But how? How do you carry the soul of a vanished world without even knowing it? How does a civilization collapse and the people stay? The answer isn't what you've been told. It's not about empires, wars, or myths. It's buried far deeper than that. To find it, we need to go back, not to Athens or Sparta, but to a time before language, before cities, before anyone ever called this place Greece. Because the real story of Greek DNA doesn't start with philosophers or soldiers. It begins in silence, in the shadows of a forgotten world. A world that left no monuments, only whispers in the genes. Picture this, a land not yet called Greece. No temples, no statues, no names carved into stone. Just a rough, wind-beaten landscape, wild and silent, where fire was survival and every day was a question of life or death. Around 30,000 years ago, long before the first word of Homer or the first whisper of democracy, small bands of people moved through the Aegean. They weren't kings or warriors. They were survivors. They hunted with flint tools, slept in caves like Cleopatra, and followed the rhythm of the earth as the Ice Age pushed shorelines and forests into strange new shapes. They left no myths, no cities, only the quiet crackle of firelight and footprints in the mud. And yet, they're still here. Not in books or ruins, but in blood. Modern Greeks carry rare genetic markers, ancient lineages buried deep in their DNA. Mitochondrial haplogroups like U5 and K, and Y-DNA like I2. Traces of those same hunter-gatherers who once gazed out at the icy Aegean with no idea of what the future held. These aren't just statistics. They're fragments of real people. People who breathed, bled, dreamed, and died in a land that had no name, and whose DNA somehow lived on through every upheaval that followed. It's wild, isn't it? That something so fragile, a bloodline, could survive everything time threw at it? Most ancient lineages in Europe didn't make it. They vanished under waves of migration and war. But in Greece, something clung on. Silent, unbroken. These weren't the people of myth or marble, but they were the beginning, the raw, untouched beginning of something bigger than they could have imagined. And if your ancestry reaches back to this region, a piece of their story still lives inside you. But here's the real mystery. How do you go from small, scattered tribes hiding in caves to building the first great civilization of Europe? How does a land of fire and stone give birth to palaces, poetry, and gods? The answer lies in a moment that changed everything, not with war, but with wheat. And what happened next didn't just shape Greece. It rewrote the future of humanity. Something incredible happened around 9,000 years ago. Not with battles or bloodshed, but with barley. From across the sea, quiet boats arrived. Not warriors, not conquerors, but farmers. They came from what's now Anatolia, carrying more than seeds and tools. They brought a new way of life and a new layer of DNA. This wasn't an invasion in the way we usually think of it. No burning cities, no collapsing walls. Just the slow, powerful pull of change. These Neolithic families settled in the Aegean, and instead of taking, they planted. Wheat, lentils, olives, goats. They turned rough soil into harvest and survival into security. And they mixed, slowly but surely, with the hunter-gatherers already living in the land. And here's the twist. These ancient farmers carried specific genetic markers, Y-DNA like J2 and G2A, and maternal lines like H, T, and N1A. These markers, these quiet signatures of a prehistoric migration, are still alive today. Not as legends, as biology. Modern Greeks still carry these farming genes in overwhelming numbers. In fact, the same lineages that arrived with the earliest plows are some of the most common in Greek people right now. Meaning, quite literally, the same blood that turned wild hills into gardens is still flowing in the people who walk those same hills today. Think about that. The olives on your plate, the bread on your table, the vines twisting through a village courtyard. They might all be part of a ritual that's been passed down in blood for 9,000 years. Your lunch today might have been planted by your ancestors, before written language, before pyramids, before myth. But this only raises a deeper mystery. Because farming is one thing, civilization is another. Growing food doesn't explain how the same land would one day give rise to labyrinths and palaces, to gods carved in marble and cities built to defy time. So if these early Greeks were farmers who taught them to build empires, the answer comes from an island where no one spoke Greek, and where the future of Europe was already being written in a language no one today can read. Long before Athens, before Sparta, before anyone called themselves Greek, there was Crete. And on this island, something astonishing happened. A people rose from the soil, from the seeds planted generations before. They didn't build huts. They built palaces, massive, multi-story wonders, with open courtyards, painted frescoes, and plumbing systems thousands of years ahead of their time. They carved thrones into stone. They crafted jewelry that still gleams today in museums. They created Europe's first true civilization. We call them the Minoans. But here's what's strange. For all their brilliance, the Minoans left behind a written script that no one, not historians, not linguists, not AI, has ever been able to read. It's called Linear A, and it covers clay tablets, storage jars, temple seals, whole records of trade, belief, maybe even literature, locked away behind symbols we can't understand. It's like a lost voice from the past, frozen in time, whispering something we're still not ready to hear. And who were these people, really? Their DNA tells a shocking story. The Minoans weren't invaders. They weren't newcomers. They were direct descendants of those first Neolithic farmers, the same ones who crossed the sea with seeds in their hands. There was no great migration, no conquering army, no outsiders shaping their destiny, no steppe DNA, no Indo-Europeans, just a native Aegean people who built a dazzling world all on their own and then vanished. They rose from the ground and disappeared into it again. And yet, something survived them, because shortly after the Minoans faded, something new arrived in the Aegean, a different language, a new kind of warrior, a culture that would lay the foundation for everything we now call Greek. But here's the twist. The people didn't disappear. Only the voice changed. So the question is, how did outsiders bring a new language without replacing the blood of the people? And what kind of civilization is born when one tongue dies and another rises in the exact same veins? Around 1600 BC, a new power rose from the hills of the mainland. A people who would leave golden death masks in royal tombs, build fortified palaces, and sing the first words of the Greek language. These were the Mycenaeans. Warriors. Kings. The world Homer would one day turn into legend. Their cities weren't gentle like the open courtyards of Crete. They were walls of stone and bronze, built for siege and survival. This was a civilization that thought in battles, wrote in Linear B, a new script, a new sound, and buried its dead with weapons and wealth. They came with stories of gods and heroes, of thunder and vengeance. They felt different, sharper, louder, and yet they weren't strangers. For years, scholars believed they must have invaded, that these early Greek speakers came from the north, swept in with chariots and fire, and replaced the soft, mysterious world of the Minoans. But the DNA says otherwise. When scientists analyzed the remains of Mycenaean people, they were stunned. Under the armor, under the language, was something ancient and familiar. Genetically, the Mycenaeans were still 75% Minoan. Only a small portion, maybe 10 to 20%, came from the Indo-European steppe. In other words, the voice had changed, but the body hadn't. It wasn't an invasion in the usual sense. No mass slaughter. No disappearance of the old population. It was more like a shift in the wind, a cultural change, not a genetic one. The newcomers didn't erase the people they met. They added something new, something sharp and lasting, to a song that had already been playing for thousands of years. It's rare. Invasions usually wipe out what came before. But here, the story got louder, not lost. So what does that mean? When a civilization's language is replaced, but its DNA stays almost untouched, what really happened? Who led the charge, and who stayed behind the scenes, quietly holding on to the past? Because not long after the Mycenaeans reached their peak, everything, again, fell apart. And this time, the collapse would be so total, so world-ending, that some believed Greece had vanished for good. But the blood had other plans. Around 1200 BC, the world changed, fast and violently. The great palaces of Mycenae and Pylos, those mighty stone strongholds of early Greece, went up in flames. Whole cities vanished from the map. Trade routes died, writing disappeared, and the echo of war spread across the Mediterranean. Egypt barely held on. The Hittites were gone. And in Greece, the light seemed to go out. This moment, the Bronze Age collapse, has haunted historians for centuries. What caused it? War, famine, earthquakes, maybe all of the above. But whatever the reason, the Mycenaean world, with all its gold and glory, fell into dust. And for a long time, people believed it took the people with it. Ancient writers told of the Dorian invasion, a shadowy northern tribe sweeping into a broken land, wiping out the old population, and replacing it with a new Greek world. It made sense on paper. The language changed. The art became simpler. The society seemed to reset. But there was one problem. The DNA doesn't agree. When scientists studied Iron Age remains, the people who lived in Greece after the supposed Dorian invasion, they expected a shift. A new gene pool. A new people. But what they found was continuity. The Iron Age Greeks looked almost identical to the Mycenaeans. No mass genetic turnover. No erased population. The people hadn't vanished. They'd stayed. Maybe the kings were gone. Maybe the palaces fell. But the bloodlines, the farmers, the shepherds, the mothers and sons, they didn't go anywhere. They kept planting, kept burying their dead, kept whispering old stories by firelight. They watched as their world crumbled, and somehow, they kept moving forward. It's a powerful reminder that history isn't always written by the survivors. Sometimes it's written over them, but their bodies, their children, their genes carry the real story. Civilizations can fall, but people, families, blood, memory survive in silence. And once that silence ended, Greece didn't just return. It exploded into something the world had never seen. But how did a land that lost everything give birth to the foundations of Western civilization? Out of the ashes of collapse, something extraordinary rose. Not just a recovery, a transformation. In the centuries after the Mycenaean fall, Greece didn't disappear. It reinvented itself. Cities emerged from the dust. Athens, Corinth, Thebes. A new rhythm took hold, one of ideas, not empires. Philosophy, poetry, theater. Democracy itself was born in a place where writing had once been forgotten. It felt like a miracle, a burst of light from a land that had once gone dark. This was the classical era, the golden age, the Greece that shaped how we think, how we speak, how we govern. Names like Socrates, Pericles, and Plato echo through time. We picture marble statues, sunlit forums, the sound of debate rising between columns. It feels like a brand new world. But here's the twist. The people weren't new at all. Modern genetics tells us something that still stuns scholars. The Greeks of this golden age, the thinkers, the builders, the soldiers of Marathon, carried the same DNA as their Mycenaean ancestors. The same blend of Neolithic farmer, Bronze Age artisan, and a small trace of steppe wanderer. No great replacement. No sudden genetic shift. The blood of palace builders became the blood of philosophers. It's not just in mainland Greece, either. When Greek city-states spread out, founding colonies in Sicily and southern Italy, what we call Magna Graecia, they took more than language and art with them. They carried their DNA. And even today, in the genes of southern Italians, echoes of that ancient Greek ancestry are still there, a thread stretching across centuries and seas. So it makes you wonder, were the minds that shaped Western civilization, the poets, the mathematicians, the rebels who questioned the gods, actually the biological descendants of those same villagers who once farmed olives and worshipped forgotten deities under a Mycenaean sun? And if they were, what happened when the world's greatest empires finally arrived on Greek soil, armed with roads, armies, and ambition? Surely that changed everything, right? Then came the Romans, with their legions and their laws, their marble statues and Latin inscriptions. They marched into Greece not just as conquerors, but as admirers. They saw in Greece something they wanted to preserve, not destroy. They built roads through ancient hills, erected theaters beside older ruins, and filled their libraries with Greek words. For centuries, Greece lived under Roman rule. But behind the armor and architecture, something odd was happening. Because while Roman culture seeped into every corner, the language, the system, the empire, the people of Greece didn't change much. Not deep down. Modern DNA tells us the truth. In cities like Corinth or Athens, you can see faint traces of Western European genes, markers like H1 or R1BL11, signs of Roman soldiers, merchants, or settlers mixing with the locals. But once you leave the urban centers, that genetic signature fades. The countryside, where most Greeks lived, stayed almost untouched. The farmers, the shepherds, the mountain families, they carried on, generation after generation, as they always had. So yes, the Romans ruled. But genetically, Greece didn't become them. It's strange, isn't it? The empire that covered continents, that swallowed civilizations whole, barely left a dent in the Greek genome. The temples changed, the politics changed, even the gods had to share space, but the blood stayed local. And just when you think the story might settle, just when Greece seems absorbed into the Roman world, something even more surprising begins. Because Rome doesn't last forever. And when it breaks, it doesn't vanish, it transforms. What rises next isn't just a continuation. It's an empire of faith, of icons, of gold and fire. And its capital isn't Rome anymore. It's Constantinople. After Rome crumbled in the west, its soul moved east, to a city called Byzantium, soon to be renamed Constantinople. And for over 1,000 years, Greece became part of something new. The Byzantine Empire. An empire not built on conquest alone, but on faith, ritual, and flame-lit churches echoing with chants in ancient tongues. It was a world of golden icons, towering mosaics, and emperors crowned by patriarchs. A place where the cross ruled as much as the crown. And through it all, through sieges, betrayals, and unthinkable wars, the people stayed. Persians came. Crusaders came. Arabs sailed in from the south. Slavs pushed in from the north. Borders shifted like sand in the wind. Cities rose and fell again and again. But somehow, the blood of the land barely moved. Genetic studies show something almost eerie. Even after 1,000 years under Byzantine rule, even after countless invasions and foreign garrisons, the core DNA of the Greek people stayed largely the same. Minor Slavic influence appeared in the north, especially in places where tribes settled in small pockets. But the genetic signature of most Greeks, the deep blend of Neolithic farmers, Bronze Age builders, and a trace of steppe ancestry, it held firm. 1,000 years of war and prayer, and the DNA barely budged. How is that possible? How does a people hold on to their identity, not just in books or ruins, but in their very cells, through centuries of chaos? What kept the bloodline so intact, even when emperors fell and cathedrals turned to ash? And just when the empire seemed eternal, it too came to an end. But the fall of Byzantium wasn't the final chapter, because what came next was supposed to break everything. A new empire from a different world, armed not only with armies, but with an entirely new culture and language. Everyone expected change, but what they got was something else entirely. When Constantinople finally fell in 1453, the world watched in silence. The last light of Byzantium was gone, and in its place rose a new empire, the Ottomans. For the next 400 years, Greece lived under their rule. Mosques replaced churches. New laws were enforced. A foreign language filled the air. This wasn't just another kingdom. It was a complete shift in power, culture, and faith. And yet the blood didn't change. You might expect centuries of Ottoman rule to have left a deep mark on Greek DNA. After all, in Anatolia, the heart of the empire, the genetic landscape was completely reshaped by waves of Central Asian ancestry. But in Greece, that wave never came. Study after study shows that modern Greeks carry almost no trace of Central Asian genes. Despite 4 centuries under foreign control, the genetic imprint of the Ottomans is barely detectable. The language may have changed on the surface. The religion may have shifted in the courts. But the DNA, the deep biological roots of the people, stayed the same. So here's a challenge for you. If 400 years of occupation, forced conversions, heavy taxation, and political dominance didn't rewrite the Greek genome, what did? And the answer, surprisingly, is almost nothing. The Greek DNA, forged from ancient farmers, Bronze Age builders, and a whisper of Indo-European ancestry, held its shape through every empire. It didn't break. It didn't blend. It survived. And maybe that's the most incredible part of the entire story. Because in a continent defined by waves of migration, where languages and borders rise and fall like tides, Greek DNA might be the closest thing Europe has to a living time capsule. But what does that time capsule actually look like today? What secrets still live inside the cells of modern Greeks? And what makes their genetic signature unlike anything else in the ancient world? So what does this ancient time capsule actually contain? If you look deep into the DNA of modern Greeks, past the noise of history and the chaos of conquest, you'll find something remarkably steady. It's not just old, it's stubborn, unshaken, still carrying the same signals that first appeared in the Aegean thousands of years ago. In the paternal lines, the Y-DNA passed from fathers to sons. Names like J2A, J2B, E1B1B, and G2A come up again and again. These are the same markers carried by the early farmers, the palace builders of the Bronze Age, the Minoans, the Mycenaeans. These aren't just scientific codes. They're signatures, carved into blood, not stone. On the maternal side, the mtDNA passed from mothers to children. The same story continues. Haplogroups like H, T, K, and U dominate. These are some of the oldest lineages in Europe. Some trace back to Neolithic villages, others to Ice Age shelters. What's truly incredible is how unchanged this mix has remained. Across thousands of years, from the arrival of writing to the fall of empires, the core structure of Greek DNA didn't drift. It didn't dilute like so many other populations around it. Just look around. In the Balkans, we see heavy Slavic influence from later migrations. In Turkey, Central Asian and Middle Eastern genes reshaped the landscape. Even the Levant has been carved and recarved by centuries of outside movement. But Greece? Greece held the line. Greek DNA isn't just ancient. It's consistent. And in a world that's always moving, always changing, that's more than unusual. That's resistance. But even within that resistance, there are places where time moves even slower. Villages tucked into mountains. Islands cut off by waves. Pockets of Greece where the DNA gets even older and even stranger. Nowhere is the power of genetic memory more visible than in the places where time slows down. High in the mountains of Crete, in stone villages hidden by winding paths and olive groves, live families whose ancestors never really left. Not in name, not in blood. These are communities that have stayed rooted to the same soil for centuries, sometimes millennia. Their customs, their dialects, even their diet, all passed down like heirlooms. But what's even more fascinating? Their genes. In these isolated pockets, scientists have found something astonishing. Rare gene variants that don't exist anywhere else in Europe. One of them, found in the highlands of Crete, is linked to remarkable heart health. A gene that seems to protect against cardiovascular disease, even in people with diets rich in animal fat. It's like a biological echo from the past, helping modern bodies survive in ways we still don't fully understand. And it doesn't stop there. These isolated communities, shaped by geography, marriage within the group, and cultural tradition, have preserved a kind of genetic clarity that's nearly vanished elsewhere. A clean thread from deep prehistory to the present, untouched by the usual storms of migration and mixing. Could it be that the answers to some of our most modern medical questions, how to fight aging, how to prevent disease, how to understand who we really are, have been sitting quietly in a remote village, passed down through silent chromosomes? What if the key to the future lies in the DNA that never left the past? Because these mountain genes aren't just rare. They're revealing something even more powerful, a connection that science is only beginning to understand between ancestry and identity, health and history. And once you see what that connection really looks like, you'll never think of heritage the same way again. Maybe now you're starting to see it. This isn't just a story about genes or haplogroups or ancient migrations. It's about memory, not the kind you carry in your mind, but the kind your body holds quietly, without needing to be asked. It's about continuity, about how something as fragile as a family, as vulnerable as a village, can last longer than kingdoms. It's about survival, not just of a people, but of their essence, passed down silently through time. Because if you have Greek ancestry, then somewhere inside you, that story is still unfolding. Not in textbooks, not in ruins, in your breath, in your bones, in the code written long before you were born, and still speaking now, without words. What if your body remembers things your mind has forgotten? What if you are the final chapter in a story written not in ink, but in blood? What if your heartbeat is an echo? Because behind the wars, the myths, the marble statues and broken temples, the real Greece, the one that endures, has always lived in the people. And maybe, just maybe, it still lives in you. But here's the part that might change everything. Because Greek DNA doesn't just link you to the past. It connects you to something deeper, something older, and maybe even someone else entirely. Another ancient people, another forgotten civilization, and a secret they've kept hidden for 4,000 years, until now. So now I have to ask you, have you ever tested your DNA? Do you know your haplogroup? Are you carrying J2, EV13, or maybe something even older? Something passed down quietly through thousands of years, waiting for you to notice? Tell me in the comments, where are your ancestors from? Have you ever felt drawn to a place without knowing why? Like something in your body recognized a landscape, a smell, a sound, before your mind ever could? That's not just imagination. That might be memory, deeper than memory. Something written into you long before you were born. If this story has made you feel something, if it made you pause, or wonder, or even feel a little bit more connected to the people who came before you, then I hope you'll stay with us. Because this is only the beginning. Next time, we're following another trail. A different ancient people. A civilization whose ruins still shape the Middle East and whose DNA still lives on in millions of people today. The Canaanites. And trust me, it's not the story you think it is. Because history fades. But your blood remembers.